The sun hung low over the rolling hills of central Texas, casting long shadows across the dusty expanse of the Rolling Plains Wildlife Preserve. It was late afternoon in early summer, the kind of day where the air shimmered with heat and the scent of dry grass and wild sage filled every breath. Jake Harlan, a 32-year-old ranch hand who'd spent his life working these lands, wiped the sweat from his brow as he guided his battered Ford pickup along the dirt service road. He'd been out checking fences all morning, repairing the barbed wire that kept the preserve's exotic herds contained, zebras, antelopes, and a small group of gazelles imported years ago for an ecotourism project that never quite took off. The preserve was a patchwork of state-protected land, dotted with scrub oak and mesquite, a far cry from the manicured zoos back east. But it was home to Jake, a place where the wild met the worn-out edges of rural America. Jake's radio crackled with the local AM station, playing some twangy country tune about lost love and open roads, but he wasn't really listening. His mind was on the evening ahead, grilling burgers with his wife, Sarah, and their 2 kids at their modest double-wide on the preserve's outskirts. Life here was simple, predictable, until the drought hit hard that year. The grass was brittle, the ground cracked like old leather, and wildfires had been popping up for weeks, fueled by lightning strikes and careless campers. The fire department had issued warnings, but out here, folks like Jake handled their own patches first. As he crested a low rise, a plume of smoke caught his eye on the horizon, thin at first, like a lazy curl from a chimney, but rising fast from the eastern field. His gut tightened. That was the grazing area for the gazelle herd, a dozen or so sleek animals brought in from African stock to diversify the preserve's offerings. Jake killed the engine and grabbed his binoculars from the dash, scanning the scene. Flames licked at the base of the tall grasses, spreading in a ragged line, driven by a fickle wind that whipped embers into the dry air. The fire wasn't massive yet, but it was hungry, devouring the parched fuel with a low roar he could almost hear from half a mile away. Before the story goes deeper, make sure to subscribe for more narratives like this. Jake's heart pounded as he floored the accelerator, the truck bouncing over ruts in the road. He'd seen fires before, helped contain a few on neighboring ranches, but this felt different, more immediate. The gazelles were skittish creatures, not like the hardy longhorns he grew up with. He grabbed his cell phone, dialing the preserve's foreman. Old Man Harlan, no relation. Just a coincidence that stuck, while steering with one hand. "Boss, we've got a fire in the east pasture. Looks like it's jumping the fence line. I'm heading in." The line buzzed with static before Harlan's gravelly voice came through. "Damn it, Jake, call the Rangers, then get your ass out of there. Don't play hero." But Jake wasn't one to sit idle. He veered off the road, tires kicking up dust as he cut across the field toward the smoke. The air grew thicker, acrid with the smell of burning sagebrush, stinging his eyes. Through the windshield he spotted the herd scattering, adults bounding in graceful leaps toward the western hills, their spotted coats flashing in the fading light. But one figure didn't move with them. In the heart of the encroaching flames, a tiny form huddled, no bigger than a house cat, its spindly legs trembling against the ground. A fawn, barely a few months old, separated from the group, surrounded by a ring of fire that was closing in like a noose. Jake slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt at the field's edge. He leaped out, boots hitting the dirt, and snatched his fire extinguisher from the truck bed. A standard issue for these parts, more for spot fires than infernos. The heat hit him like a wall, waves of it rolling off the flames that now stood 5 feet high in places, crackling and popping as they consumed the grass. Coughing into his sleeve, he advanced, spraying bursts of foam at the nearest tongues of fire, buying himself a narrow path. "Come on, little guy," he muttered, his voice lost in the roar. The fawn's eyes locked onto him, wide, dark pools of terror, its tiny body quivering, a soft bleat escaping its throat like a desperate plea. He was close now, maybe 20 feet away, the ground beneath him smoldering. The fawn didn't bolt. Instead, it staggered forward a step, then another, its legs wobbling as if begging him to close the distance. Jake's mind raced. Gazelle fawns were fragile, not built for this scorched earth. He'd read about them in the preserve's manuals, born to run, but this one was too young, two alone. Smoke billowed around them, turning the sky a hazy orange, and in that moment, with the fire's growl echoing like thunder, Jake felt a pull he couldn't explain. It wasn't just duty. It was something raw, human, the instinct to protect what couldn't protect itself. Pushing through the heat, extinguisher hissing empty, he lunged forward. The fawn collapsed against his legs, its warm fur brushing his jeans, a tiny nuzzle against his boot as if saying, "Help me." Jake scooped it up in one arm, the creature light as a feather, its heart hammering against his chest. Flames nipped at his heels as he retreated, the path behind him igniting anew. He made it to the truck just as the fire surged, diving into the cab with the fawn cradled close. Tires spun in the dirt, and he gunned it backward, away from the blaze, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Back on the service road, Jake pulled over, radioing for help while gently stroking the fawn's flank. It trembled in his lap, eyes half closed but alive, a small miracle amid the chaos. The fire raged on, sirens wailing in the distance as ranger trucks converged, but for Jake, the real story had just begun. Little did he know, this tiny gazelle would change everything, pulling him into a web of preserved politics, personal doubts, and a fight to save more than just one life from the flames threatening their world. Jake's hands shook on the steering wheel as he eased the truck back onto the service road, the fawn's shallow breath syncing with his own. The preserve's eastern boundary blurred past in a haze of dust and smoke, the fire's glow painting the dashboard an eerie red. He kept one hand on the wheel, the other gently cradling the little creature against his chest, its fur damp with sweat and soot. "Easy now," he whispered, more to himself than the animal. The radio in the cab squawked to life, Foreman Harlan's voice cutting through the static. "Jake, you copy? Rangers are en route. ETA 10 minutes. Where the hell are you?" "Clear of the field, boss. Got the fawn out. It's bad in there." Jake's voice cracked, the adrenaline crash hitting him like a freight train. He glanced down at the gazelle, its eyes fluttering open, those deep brown orbs reflecting a mix of exhaustion and wary trust. It didn't struggle, just nestled closer, as if it knew he was its only shot. The truck's engine rumbled steadily, carrying them toward the preserve's main gate, but Jake's mind raced ahead. What now? The preserve had protocols for injured wildlife, quarantine, vet checks, but this felt personal, like he'd just invited a piece of the wild into his life. By the time he pulled up to the ranch headquarters, a squat cinder-block building flanked by silos and a cluster of horse trailers, the first ranger truck was already on scene. Red lights flashed against the twilight sky, and a team in yellow Nomex suits spilled out, uncoiling hoses and barking orders. Harlan, a wiry man in his late 60s with a face like weathered oak, strode over as Jake killed the engine. His eyes narrowed at the bundle in Jake's arms. "You crazy son of a gun. Thought I told you to stay clear." But there was no real bite in his words, just the gruff concern of a man who'd lost too many hands to bad calls. Jake slid out of the cab, careful not to jostle the fawn. Couldn't leave it. The herd bolted, but this one, it was trapped, begging, almost. He handed the animal over to Harlan, who took it with surprising gentleness, wrapping it in a spare blanket from the truck bed. The foreman's calloused fingers brushed its flank, checking for burns. "No major injuries, looks like. Singed a bit, dehydrated probably. We'll get Doc Ramirez out here." Harlan nodded toward the building. "Get inside, cool off. You've earned a beer." Inside the headquarters, the air was cooler, laced with the smell of stale coffee and motor oil. Jake slumped into a metal chair at the scarred wooden table, gulping water from a jug while Harlan radioed the vet. The fawn lay on a makeshift bed of towels in the corner, its tiny chest rising and falling steadily now, the immediate terror ebbing away. Jake watched it, replaying the scene in his head, the flames closing in, that desperate bleat. He'd always been the steady type, fixing fences and hauling feed without complaint, but this stirred something deeper, a reminder of his own vulnerabilities. Sarah had been after him to take it easy, ever since their boy Tommy got sick last winter, some flu that lingered too long, rattling Jake's nerves about what else could go wrong in their fragile world. The door banged open, and in walked Lena Torres, the preserve's wildlife biologist, her ponytail swinging as she shrugged off her field vest. At 28, she was sharp as a tack, with a biology degree from Texas A&M, and a passion for the preserve's misfit herds that bordered on obsession. She'd been the one pushing for the Gazelle program, arguing it could draw eco-tourists and funding. "Heard about the fire on the scanner," she said, kneeling by the Fawn without preamble. Her hands moved efficiently, shining a penlight into its eyes, probing gently for wounds. "This one's a fighter. Thompson's Gazelle, female, I'd guess 3 months old. Separated during the panic. Mothers don't always stick if the threat's too big." Jake leaned forward, elbows on knees. "She didn't run, just looked at me." Lena glanced up, her dark eyes appraising him. "Animals read intent. You must have seemed safe." She pulled a syringe from her kit, administering a mild sedative and fluids. The Fawn stirred briefly, then settled, its body going limp in relief. Harlan cracked open a couple of cold Shiner Box from the fridge, handing one to Jake. "Fire's contained. Rangers got it before it jumped the creek. But that field's toast. Insurance'll cover the damage, but the board's gonna chew us out. Those Gazelles were their pet project." Lena straightened, wiping her hands on her jeans. "The herd's down to 11 now, counting this one. We've lost calves before to coyotes, but fire. It's the drought talking." She paced a bit, frustration etching her features. Jake knew the drill. The preserve was underfunded, squeezed between state budgets and private donors who wanted Instagram-worthy safaris without the messy reality. Last year, they'd nearly lost the whole operation to developers eyeing the land for a subdivision. "What about releasing her back?" Jake asked, sipping his beer. The cool bitterness grounded him. "Not yet," Lena replied. "She needs monitoring, could go into shock. We'll keep her in the rehab pen overnight." As if on cue, the Fawn let out a soft, contented sigh, its head lolling toward Jake's boot where it rested nearby. He reached out, scratching lightly behind its ear, feeling the rapid pulse slow under his touch. Harlan chuckled. "Look at you, turning into a softie. Next thing, you'll be naming it." But Jake didn't laugh. Driving home later, the Fawn secured in a crate in the truck bed under Lena's watchful eye. He'd volunteered to transport it to the vet clinic in Abilene. His thoughts turned inward. Sarah would worry when he didn't show for dinner, but explaining this, she'd see the soot on his clothes, the faraway look in his eyes. Their life was a rhythm of ranch work and family barbecues, church on Sundays at the little Baptist hall in town, but lately, cracks had shown. Tommy's medical bills still loomed, and Jake's long hours left Sarah handling the kids alone too often. Rescuing the Fawn felt like a small win, a spark of purpose amid the grind. The clinic lights glowed welcomingly as they pulled up, Doc Ramirez, a no-nonsense vet with a thick Texas drawl, already waiting. He examined the Fawn under the harsh fluorescence, murmuring approvals. "Tough little thing. Hydrate her, keep her warm. She'll pull through." Lena handled the handover, but Jake lingered, watching as the Fawn was tucked into a quiet stall with fresh hay and a shallow water dish. It drank tentatively at first, then more eagerly, the water dribbling down its chin. In that moment, alone with the soft sounds of the stable, Jake felt a quiet bond form. Not just rescuer and rescued, but something shared, a survival etched in fire and trust. By midnight, back home in their double-wide on the preserve's edge, Jake finally sat down with Sarah. The kids were asleep, the house quiet save for the hum of the AC. She listened as he recounted the day, her hand on his arm, eyes widening at the close call. "You could have been hurt," she said softly, but there was pride there too. "That Fawn. It's lucky it had you." Jake nodded, staring at the ceiling fan's lazy spin. The fire was out, the Fawn safe, but the embers of unease lingered. Whispers around the preserve hinted at bigger troubles, budget cuts, maybe even closing the gates. Saving one life was a start, but Jake sensed the flames of change were just beginning to spread. The next morning dawned crisp and clear over the rolling plains, the kind of Texas sky that stretched endlessly blue, as if the fire from yesterday had been nothing but a bad dream. Jake rose early, the scent of strong coffee brewing in the kitchen pulling him from a restless sleep. Sarah was already up, flipping pancakes for the kids, her hair tied back in a practical ponytail. Tommy, their 6-year-old, chattered about school, while little Mia, 4, smeared syrup on her plate, oblivious to the weight Jake carried from the night before. He kissed Sarah's cheek, murmuring thanks for the quiet understanding she'd offered, but his eyes were drawn to the window, toward the preserve's distant fence line where smoke no longer rose. By 7, he was back at work, the truck loaded with tools and a thermos of black coffee. The fire had left a blackened scar on the eastern field, a jagged wound of ash and charred stumps that the ranger crew was still mopping up. Jake parked near the rehab pen behind the headquarters, half hoping to catch a glimpse of the Fawn before starting his rounds. Lena was there already, clipboard in hand, checking the water levels in the troughs. She looked up as his boots crunched on the gravel, her expression a mix of fatigue and determination. "Morning, hero. She's doing better. Ate some alfalfa last night, no fever." Jake nodded, leaning on the fence. The pen was a simple enclosure of chain link and shade cloth, ringed by wildflowers that had somehow escaped the blaze. Inside, the Fawn stood on wobbly legs, nibbling at a pile of fresh greens, its coat still dusted with faint soot but its movements steadier. It paused, ears flicking toward him, those wide eyes locking on with a flicker of recognition that made Jake's chest tighten. "Named her yet?" he asked, echoing Harlan's joke from the day before. Lena smiled faintly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Calling her Ember for now. Fits, don't it? Tiny thing, but she burned through that fear." She hesitated, glancing around as if the empty fields might eavesdrop. "Look, Jake, about yesterday. The board's calling an emergency meeting this afternoon. That fire exposed some cracks. Fencing's outdated, water lines are dry from the drought. They're talking cuts, maybe even culling the exotics to save costs." The words hit like a gut punch. Jake had heard rumors, late-night gripes over beers at the feed store in town, but hearing it from Lena made it real. The Gazelles weren't just animals. They were the preserve's fragile dream, a nod to something bigger than barbed wire and bail bonds. "Culling? That's bullshit. These lands have been protected since my granddad's time. Folks in Austin don't get what it's like out here. Droughts, fires, all of it." Lena sighed, rubbing her temples. "I know, but the donors are pulling back and the state's pinching pennies. If we lose the herds, it's game over for ecotourism. Ember, here's a symbol now. Proof we can save what's worth fighting for." She paused, eyeing him thoughtfully. "You pulled her out. Harlan says you're solid. Think about sticking around after your shift. I could use backup at the meeting. Fresh eyes, someone who knows the ground." Jake shifted, uncomfortable with the spotlight. He was a ranch hand, not a crusader. Good with a hammer and a lasso. But speeches? Still, the Fawn's gaze pulled at him, a silent nudge. "Yeah, all right. For her." The morning dragged on with routine grit, mending a sagging fence along the creek bed, where the water ran low and murky, and hauling salt licks to the remaining gazelle herd, now huddled in the shaded north pasture. The adults moved like ghosts of the savannah, their leaps graceful but edged with wariness, scanning for threats that weren't there. Jake watched them from horseback, the sun beating down on his Stetson, sweat tracing lines through the dust on his neck. His mind wandered to Tommy's last doctor's visit, the bills stacking up like cordwood on the kitchen counter. The preserve job paid steady, but if it folded, what then? Subdivisions creeping in, turning wild land into cul-de-sacs and McMansions. He'd seen it happen to the old Thompson spread down the road. By noon he broke for lunch under a lone pecan tree, scarfing a peanut butter sandwich while his radio buzzed with updates. Harlan's voice came through, terse. "Meetings at 2 in the conference room. Bring your game face." Jake finished his meal and headed back, the truck's AC blasting cool relief against his skin. At headquarters, the parking lot was filling up. Ranger trucks, a couple of sedans from the board, even the local reporter from the Abilene paper sniffing around for a story. Jake parked and smoothed his shirt, catching his reflection in the side mirror. Tired eyes, a smudge of ash he hadn't noticed. Inside, the conference room hummed with tension, the air thick with the aroma of vending machine coffee. Harlan presided at the head of the table, flanked by Lena and a handful of board members, mostly ranchers and a silver-haired banker from town. Jake slipped into a back chair, feeling out of place among the suits and clipboards. The discussion kicked off with damage reports. 20 acres scorched. Feed costs up 30%. No injuries to staff, but the herd down 1. Then came the hammer. Budget projections flashing on a battered projector, red ink bleeding across the slides. "We're bleeding cash," intoned Mr. Ellis, the banker, his voice like dry gravel. "The Gazelle program's a luxury we can't afford. Sell them off to a zoo, cut the exotics, focus on native stock. Or worse, lease the land." Lena shot to her feet, her voice steady but fierce. "That luxury draws volunteers, grants. Ember's proof. We saved her because we're equipped to. Culling's a cop-out. It ignores the real fire. Climate change, underfunding." Heads turned, murmurs rippling. Jake's pulse quickened. He could picture the Fawn alone in that pen, the preserve's heart if it beat at all. When the room quieted, eyes drifted to him. Harlan's nod, a silent cue. Jake cleared his throat, standing awkwardly. "I ain't much for talking, but I was there yesterday. That fire wasn't just bad luck, it's what happens when we skimp. The Fawn, Ember, she didn't choose to be here, but she trusted us. If we fold now, what's left? Just more dust and empty fields." His words hung simple, raw, born from the gut rather than notes. A few nods, Ellis's brow furrowing. The meeting stretched into the afternoon, votes tabled for now, but the undercurrent of doubt lingered like smoke. As folks filed out, Lena clapped Jake on the shoulder. That was good, real good. He shrugged it off, but inside a spark ignited, not just for the job, but for the fight. Driving home later, the sun dipping low, he detoured to the clinic. Ember greeted him with a soft bleat through the stall bars, nuzzling his offered hand. In her eyes, he saw his own stakes, family, land, the thin line between holding on and letting go. The preserve's flames might be banked, but Jake knew the real heat was building, testing everyone who called this place home. The days blurred into a tense rhythm at the Rolling Plains Preserve. The scorched earth of the eastern field serving as a stark reminder of how close they'd come to disaster. Jake threw himself into the work with a renewed edge, repairing irrigation lines that snaked through the parched pastures like brittle veins. The drought hadn't let up, the sun baking the ground into a mosaic of cracks, and every task felt like a holding pattern against the inevitable. Harlan had him on extended shifts, coordinating with the rangers to monitor the remaining Gazelle herd, their numbers now a fragile 11, including the wandering calves that stuck close to their mothers under the sparse shade of mesquite trees. Ember's recovery became Jake's quiet anchor. He made excuses to swing by the clinic in Abilene after his rounds, dropping off fresh clippings or just checking in with Doc Ramirez, who grumbled good-naturedly about the extra paperwork. The Fawn was a quick healer, her spindly legs gaining strength by the day, but Lena insisted on caution. "She's bonded to you," the biologist said one afternoon, as Jake leaned against the stall door, feeding Ember tufts of sweetgrass through the bars. The little Gazelle's tongue flicked out delicately, her eyes softening in that way that tugged at something deep in Jake's chest. Animals like her imprint fast. It's why she didn't bolt from the fire. You were her safe harbor. Jake nodded, scratching behind her ear, feeling the warmth of her coat against his calluses. He hadn't told Lena the full truth, that nights at home, with the kids tucked in and Sarah dozing beside him, he'd lie awake replaying the rescue, the flames roar mixing with Tommy's coughs from the next room. The boy's health had improved since winter, but the fear lingered, a shadow that made every risk Jake took feel heavier. Saving Ember wasn't just about the preserve. It was about proving he could shield what mattered, even when the world conspired to burn it down. Trouble brewed back at headquarters, though, where the board's emergency meeting had only delayed the hard choices. Whispers turned to outright arguments during the weekly staff huddle, Harlan's office thick with the smell of burnt coffee and frustration. Mr. Ellis, the banker with his polished boots and ledger mindset, pushed hardest for cuts. "We've got liabilities here," he'd say, tapping his pen against a stack of reports. "Exotics draw attention, but they cost more in feed and vet bills. Focus on deer, maybe bison, native, low maintenance." Lena fired back each time, her voice rising like a prairie wind. citing studies on biodiversity and tourism stats that promised revival if they just held the line. Jake stayed on the fringes at first, but Lena pulled him in deeper, asking for his input on patrol routes and herd health checks. It was unfamiliar territory. Him, the guy who'd dropped out of community college to work the land, now sketching maps on napkins and weighing in on funding pitches. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in bruised purples, they walked the north pasture together. The gazelles grazed warily, their ears twitching at the crunch of boots on dry grass. "Ellis wants to auction off half the herd next month," Lena confided, her face shadowed under her wide-brim hat. "Says it'll balance the books. But I've got a lead, a grant from the Wildlife Federation. If we can show progress, like with Ember's rehab, it might sway them." Jake stopped, watching a mother gazelle nudge her calf forward, the pair mirroring the bond he felt with his own kids. What if it doesn't? Place like this, it's more than numbers. My granddad used to say these hills have stories in the dirt. Lose them. And we're just renting space from the developers. Lena turned to him, surprise flickering in her eyes. "Didn't peg you for the poetic type, Harlan." He shrugged, a half-smile cracking his dust-streaked face. "Blame the fawn. Makes a man think." That night home felt both sanctuary and pressure cooker. Sarah had dinner waiting, brisket slow-cooked with onions, the aroma filling there double-wide as the kids clamored around the table. Tommy, his cheeks flushed from play, asked about the baby deer Jake had mentioned, his small hands waving animatedly. "Did it really beg you, Daddy? Like in the movies?" Jake ruffled his hair, pulling him onto his knee. "Something like that, bud. She was scared, but brave. Kinda like you when you beat that cough." Sarah caught his eye from across the room, her expression a mix of worry and quiet support. Later, as they washed dishes side by side, the water running hot over sudsy plates, she broached it gently. "You're different since the fire. More fired up. The preserve in trouble?" He dried a glass, the cloth twisting in his grip. "Yeah, might not make it through the year if the board guts it, but I'm helping Lena fight back. Feels right." Sarah set down a plate, turning to face him, her hands damp and cool on his arms. "Just don't burn yourself out. We've got our own fires here. Bills, Tommy's checkups. Promise me you'll come home whole." Jake pulled her close, the hug lingering in the dim kitchen light, the weight of her words settling like dew on parched soil. He promised, but doubt gnawed at him, the preserve's fate tangled with his own, threads pulling tighter. The turning point came midweek, during a routine supply run to the feed store in town. Jake's truck rattled down the highway, radio tuned to a sports talk show debating the Rangers' latest slump, when his phone buzzed on the dash. It was Harlan, voice tight. "Get back here now." Ember's loose, Pengate jammed in the wind. She's headed toward the old creek bed. Jake's foot hit the accelerator, heart slamming as he U-turned without signaling, horns blaring from an oncoming semi. The preserve's back trails were a maze of gullies and thorns, easy for a spooked fawn to vanish into, especially one still healing. He arrived to chaos. Lena and a couple rangers scrambling with ropes and flashlights, the sun already low. Harlan pointed toward the scrub, where Ember's tracks, delicate imprints in the dust, trailed into the underbrush. Storm last night loosened the latch. She's fast but disoriented. Jake didn't hesitate, grabbing a halter from the truck and plunging into the brush, thorns snagging his jeans like accusatory fingers. The air hummed with cicadas, the ground uneven underfoot, and every rustle set his nerves on edge. "Ember," he called softly, the name feeling natural now, a tether in the fading light. Deeper in, near the dry creek where water had carved shallow banks, he spotted her, huddled against a boulder, sides heaving, eyes wide with fresh panic. Coyotes howled in the distance, a reminder of the wild's indifference. She bleated weakly as he approached, not fleeing but trembling, her trust frayed but intact. "Hey, girl, it's me," Jake murmured, kneeling slowly, extending a hand with a handful of greens from his pocket. She nosed them, then pressed against his palm, the contact electric. With gentle coaxing, he slipped the halter on. Leading her out step by careful step, the rangers' relieved voices echoing as they emerged. Back at the pen, reinforced now with new latches, Lena checked her over, finding only scrapes. "You did it again," she said, gratitude thick in her tone. Jake just nodded, watching Ember settle into the hay, her gaze following him even as he turned away. That night, driving home under a canopy of stars, the rescue replayed in his mind, not as heroics, but as necessity. The preserve's battles were mounting, Ellis's auction looming like a storm cloud, but Jake felt the shift inside him. He wasn't just holding the line anymore. He was ready to push back, for the land, the Fawn, and the life it all anchored. The flames might have started it, but the real fire now burned in resolve, testing how far he'd go to keep the wild alive. The tension at the Rolling Plains Preserve thickened like the humid air before a summer storm, every day bringing new strains that tested the fragile balance Jake had come to rely on. The auction threat loomed larger now, with Mr. Ellis circulating memos that detailed projected savings from selling off the Gazelles, cold figures that ignored the sweat and stories behind the herds. Harlan called extra meetings in his cramped office, the walls papered with faded maps and yellowed photos of the preserve's founding days, back when it was just a bunch of dreamers fencing in wild spaces against the sprawl. Jake found himself there more often, not as the quiet handyman anymore, but as Lena's unofficial ally, his practical insights cutting through the board's abstractions like a well-honed blade. Ember's presence amplified it all, her recovery a small beacon in the rehab pen that drew curious glances from staff and even a few locals who'd heard the tale through the grapevine. Jake stopped by daily after his fence checks, bringing scraps of carrot from Sarah's garden, or just sitting on the overturned bucket outside the enclosure, talking low about nothing and everything. The Fawn had grown bolder, pressing her nose to the chain link, her soft bleats a rhythm that synced with the distant lowing of cattle on neighboring ranches. "You're stirring up trouble, you know that," he murmured one afternoon as she nuzzled his fingers through the fence. Lena had confided that Ember's story was making rounds in wildlife circles, a potential hook for the grant application, complete with photos of the rescue scar on the eastern field. But Jake saw the risks too. Publicity could sway the board, or it could paint a target on the preserve's back, inviting scrutiny from regulators who'd long-eyed the underfunded operation. Home life mirrored the unease, the double-wide's cozy confines feeling smaller under the weight of unspoken worries. Sarah had taken to scanning the local paper each morning over her coffee, the headlines about drought aid and land sales hitting too close. Tommy, ever the sensitive one, picked up on the shifts, drawing pictures of Daddy's deer with crayons that bled orange flames around the edges. "Is she going to be okay?" he'd ask at bedtime, curled under his dinosaur sheets, his small voice pulling at Jake's resolve. Mia, oblivious in her toddler world, chased fireflies in the yard at dusk, her laughter a brief respite. But nights were harder. Jake tossed beside Sarah, the ceiling fan whirring like a distant siren, his mind replaying boardroom arguments and Ember's trusting gaze. "We're in this together," Sarah whispered one evening, her head on his shoulder as thunder rumbled far off. "But if it means losing you to the fight." He squeezed her hand, the promise from the dishes lingering. But the pull of the preserve grew stronger, a current he couldn't swim against. The real fracture came on a sweltering Friday when Harlan gathered the core team in the barn loft for an off-the-books strategy session. Hay bales served as seats, the air heavy with dust motes dancing in shafts of sunlight filtering through the slats. Lena unrolled a blueprint of the preserve, marking spots for new fire breaks and solar pumps to combat the drought. "The grants are shot," she said, her marker squeaking across the paper. "But Ellis is moving fast. Auction's set for 2 weeks out unless we show results. Ember's rehab could be the proof. Documented progress. Visitor logs from her story going viral on social media." Jake leaned in, tracing the lines with a calloused finger. "Viral? Folks in town barely check their email, but if we get boots on the ground, eco-tours, school groups, it might tip the scales." Harlan grunted agreement, his pipe clenched unlit between his teeth. "Problem is manpower. Rangers are stretched thin with patrol duties, and the budget won't cover overtime." Eyes turned to Jake, the room's quiet expectation settling on him like a yoke. He'd never sought leadership, content with the rhythm of dawn patrols and evening drives home, but the Fawn's rescue had shifted something irreversible. "I'll pull extra," he offered, the words tasting of commitment. "Weekends too, if it keeps the gates open." Lena's smile was grateful but shadowed. She knew the toll it would take on his family, the hours stealing from baseball games and family suppers. That resolve was tested sooner than expected. Saturday morning brought a call from Doc Ramirez, the clinic's line buzzing Jake awake at 6, Sarah still asleep beside him. "Your girl's agitated," the vet drawled, static crackling over the miles. "Pacing the stall won't eat. Might be stress from the noise, road crews blasting near the highway for that new overpass." Jake was in the truck before the coffee cooled, the engine roaring to life as he waved off Sarah's concerned frown from the porch. The drive to Abilene felt endless, the flatlands blurring past under a relentless sun, radio forecasts warning of more dry lightning on the horizon. At the clinic, Ember huddled in the corner of her enclosure, ears flat, her usual spark dimmed. She perked at his voice, trotting over with a weak nudge against his knee, but her ribs showed sharper under the fur, the weight loss evident. Ramirez joined him, stethoscope dangling. "Physically sound, but she's pining. Imprinted hard on you, son. Needs familiar ground to bounce back." Jake nodded, the vet's words echoing Lena's warnings. With Ramirez's okay, he loaded Ember into a reinforced crate in the truck bed, the drive back a careful crawl to avoid jolts. She bleated softly through the vents, a sound that twisted in his gut like barbed wire. By noon, they had her settled in a temporary pen at headquarters, closer to the heart of the preserve, with Harlan's gruff approval. "Just don't make a habit of playing house," the foreman teased, but his eyes held respect. Word spread fast. Lena arrived with supplements and monitoring gear, turning the relocation into an impromptu photo op for the grant pitch. A local blogger, tipped off by a ranger, showed up with a camera, snapping shots of Jake hand-feeding Ember under the oak shade. "This here's the hero, Fawn," he said awkwardly to the lens, the story spilling out in halting sentences about flames and pleas. The post went live that afternoon, shares rippling through Texas wildlife groups, comments flooding in, "Real American grit," and "Save the plains." For a moment hope flickered. Ellis even called Harlan, tone less hostile, hinting at a review of the auction timeline. But elation soured by evening when Jake got home late, the sky bruised with storm clouds that promised rain but delivered only heat. Sarah met him at the door, arms crossed, the kitchen light casting harsh shadows on her face. "Tommy asked for you at the park today. Said Daddy's too busy saving deer to play catch." Her voice cracked, the exhaustion plain, the double shifts at the diner, wrangling the kids solo. Jake deflated, pulling her into a hug that smelled of hay and regret. "It's not just the deer, Sarah. It's us, the land, the life we've built. If the preserve goes, we're next. Developers'll swallow this place whole." She pulled back, eyes searching his. "And if you burn out fighting it, who's left for us?" The question hung unanswered as thunder finally broke, rain pattering on the tin roof like hesitant applause. In the quiet hours after the kids slept, Jake sat on the porch steps, watching droplets carve paths in the dust. Ember's bleat echoed in his memory, a tiny echo of the bigger roar building around them, the board's indecision, the grant's uncertainty, the personal costs mounting like unpaid bills. He'd pushed the line today, bringing her home ground. But the real push was coming, a turning point where resolve met reality. The preserve's survival wasn't just about herds or budgets anymore. It was about the threads holding his world together, fraying under the strain of flames both literal and figurative. As lightning forked the horizon, Jake felt the storm's approach, knowing the next choice would define not just the land, but the man he was becoming. The storm that had teased the Texas plains finally unleashed its fury overnight, dumping a rare inch of rain that turned the preserve's dirt roads into slick ribbons of mud. Jake woke to the patter on the roof, a sound so foreign after months of drought that it felt like a gift. But the relief was short-lived. By dawn, the clouds had parted, leaving the air heavy and the ground steaming under the climbing sun. He kissed Sarah goodbye in the kitchen, her eyes still shadowed from their late-night talk, and headed out with a thermos of coffee that tasted bitter on his tongue. The preserve needed him more than ever now. Ember's relocation had bought time, but the board's next meeting was looming, and the viral post about her rescue was stirring a horsey mix of hope and hassle. At headquarters, the yard was a churn of activity. Rangers in mud-caked boots hosing down trucks, Harlan barking orders over the crackle of his radio. Lena waved Jake over from the rehab pen, where Ember stood alert, her coat glistening from the rain, munching on a fresh bundle of clover. The fawn's energy had returned full force. She bounded to the fence at his approach, her small hooves clicking against the damp earth, nuzzling his outstretched hand with an insistence that bordered on playful. "Look at her," Lena said, clipboard tucked under her arm, a genuine smile breaking through her usual intensity. That rain perked everything up. "Vets say she's ready for gradual integration, short supervised grazes with the herd. If we document it right, it's gold for the grant." Jake crouched, running his fingers along Ember's flank, feeling the steady thrum of her pulse. The scrapes from her escape had healed to faint lines hidden under her soft, tawny fur, but the bond between them was etched deeper. "She's tough. Like you said, imprinted." He straightened, wiping mud from his jeans, and glanced toward the conference room window, where shadows moved like gathering storm clouds. "Any word from Ellis? That post got thousands of shares. Folks from Dallas to San Antonio are talking." Lena's expression tightened, the optimism fading. "He's doubling down. Called Harlan this morning. Says the publicity's a flash in the pan, and we're still in the red. Auction's locked unless the grant comes through by week's end. But get this. He's floating a deal with a private zoo up north. Ship the gazelles out, pocket the cash, turn the east field into grazing for cattle leases." She kicked at a puddle, water splashing up like frustrated sparks. Jake's jaw set. He'd driven past those feedlots on the highway, endless rows of penned misery that stripped the land bare. The preserve wasn't perfect, but it was alive. Mesquite whispering in the wind, herds moving free under wide skies. Losing it to that would gut the soul of the place. The morning shifted into a grind of preparation. Jake helped reinforce the fire breaks around the north pasture, the wet soil yielding easier under the shovel, but each scoop unearthed roots twisted like warnings. Harlan joined him midway, his old John Deere hat pulled low, sweat beading on his leathery forehead despite the cooler air. "You're in deep now, kid," the foreman said, leaning on his post-hole digger. "Lena's got fire in her belly, but Ellis, he's got the board's ear. Banker type see dollars, not dirt." Jake paused, wiping his brow with a forearm smeared in clay. "Then we show 'em both. Ember's not just a story, she's why we fight. My boy's been drawing her every night, makes him believe in second chances." Harlan nodded, a rare softness cracking his gruff facade. "Family's the real stake. Lost my place to developers back in '98. Won't let it happen here." They worked in companionable silence after that, the rhythm of labor a balm against the uncertainty. By lunch, the pen was ready for Ember's first outing. Lena led the way, Jake carrying a halter and a bucket of treats, the fawn trailing on a loose lead like an eager pup. The herd grazed in the distance, their sleek forms silhouetted against the rolling hills, the rain-fresh grass a vibrant green that hadn't been seen in seasons. Ember froze at first, ears perked, sniffing the air thick with the scent of wet earth and distant wildflowers. Then, with a tentative bound, she edged forward, the lead slack in Jake's hand. It was a small triumph, Ember mingling with a yearling, their noses touching in curious sniffs. But Lena filmed it all, narrating softly for the grant video. Jake hung back, heart swelling at the sight, but a shout from the ridge pulled him up short. A ranger waved frantically, pointing east where a dust plume rose like a bad omen. "Trouble, truck at the gate. Ellis and his cronies, early for the walk-through." The air soured instantly. Jake secured Ember back in the pen, her protests a soft bleat that echoed his own frustration, and trudged to the entrance, mud sucking at his boots. Ellis arrived in a gleaming SUV flanked by 2 board members in pressed khakis and a slick consultant from Austin, all stepping out like they owned the dirt they trod on. Harlan met them with forced civility, but tension crackled as they toured the scarred field, the consultant snapping photos with a tablet that beeped incessantly. Impressive damage control, Ellis remarked, his voice oily smooth, eyes skipping over the rehab pen without a glance. But let's talk viability. The exotics are a drain. Feed imports alone ate 20% of last quarter's budget. My proposal: divest, stabilize. Lena stepped forward, chin high. We've got momentum. The Fawn's recovery is trending. Donations trickling in already. Give the grant a chance. The consultant smirked, pulling up spreadsheets on his screen. Trends fade. Projections show insolvency in 18 months without cuts. Jake, silent till then, felt the words boil up. That Fawn didn't fade. She begged for help in flames we could have prevented with better funding. This ain't numbers. It's lives. The herds, the staffs, the kids who visit and learn what wild means. Ellis turned, surprise flickering before settling into condescension. Noble, Mr. Harlan, but sentiment doesn't pay bills. We're voting tomorrow. Clean slate or slow bleed. The group moved on, their voices fading toward the headquarters, leaving Jake with the churn in his gut. Lena touched his arm. You spoke up. That's something. But it didn't feel like enough. Driving the perimeter that afternoon, the truck's wipers swishing away lingering mist, Jake passed the creek bed where he'd found Ember loose, the water now a shallow trickle from the rain. It was a fragile flow, easily dammed, much like the preserve's fate. Evening brought no ease. Home was a haven of routine, Sarah's meatloaf simmering, Tommy's excited retelling of a school story about baby animals. But Jake's mind wandered, the board's vote a shadow over the table. After the kids' bedtime, he and Sarah sat on the couch, her head on his shoulder, the TV murmuring a weather report promising more dry days ahead. Ellis came today, he said finally, the words heavy, pushing hard. If they vote yes on the auction. Sarah lifted her head, eyes steady. Then we adapt. You've given it your all, Jake, but our home's here, not out there fighting ghosts. He held her gaze, the conflict raw, the preserve pulling like gravity, family anchoring like roots. Sleep came fitful, dreams tangled with flames and bleats, the dawn promising a reckoning that would either forge him stronger or break the world he'd built. Word of the vote spread like dry tinder through the preserve by morning, staff clustering in hushed groups around the coffee urn, faces etched with the same dread Jake carried. He checked on Ember first, her pen a quiet island amid the buzz, the Fawn greeting him with a joyful leap that briefly lightened the load. But Harlan's summons to the conference room pulled him back to reality, the air inside thick with the scent of cheap cologne and desperation. As the board filed in, Ellis at the fore with his briefcase of doom, Jake took his seat beside Lena, resolve hardening like cooling steel. The flames had started this, but the true test was here, in words and wills, where saving the wild meant saving himself. The conference room at the Rolling Plains Preserve felt smaller than ever that morning, the walls closing in like the dry heat of a Texas midday. Sunlight slanted through the blinds, casting striped shadows across the scarred oak table where board members shifted in their seats, papers rustling like dry leaves. Jake sat rigid beside Lena, his calloused hands clasped tight under the table, the faint scent of Ember's pen, hay and earth, still clinging to his shirt. Harlan stood at the head, his weathered face a mask of quiet defiance, while Mr. Ellis dominated the opposite end, his laptop screen glowing with unforgiving spreadsheets. The consultant from Austin fiddled with a projector, pulling up final projections that painted the preserve in shades of red ink. Outside, the wind whispered through the mesquite, carrying the distant low of cattle, a reminder of the life at stake. Ellis cleared his throat, his voice slicing through the tension like a knife through barbed wire. We've reviewed the data, the viral buzz, even that heartwarming fawn tale. But sentiment can't override solvency. The motion stands. Approve the auction of the exotic herds. Lease the East Field for grazing and redirect funds to core operations. All in favor? Hands rose slowly. 3, 4. The bankers included, while Lena's stayed planted flat on the table, her knuckles white. Jake's pulse thundered in his ears. He could see Ember in his mind's eye, bounding in her pen, oblivious to the human machinations unraveling her world. Harlan's gaze met his, a silent nod urging him forward. Jake pushed back his chair, the scrape echoing loud. Hold on. This ain't just about money. That fire last week, it was a warning. Drought's real, and cutting corners makes it worse. Ember, that fawn I pulled from the flames, she's not a line item. She's why folks are sharing our story, donating bits here and there. We've got momentum. Kill it now. And we're no better than the developers circling like vultures. His words tumbled out raw, laced with the grit of long days and deeper fears, the fear of watching his kids' wide-open world shrink to subdivisions and strip malls. Murmurs rippled. One board member, old Mrs. Caldwell from the local farm co-op, leaned forward, her silver hair catching the light. The boy's got a point. My grandkids came for a tour last month, saw those gazelles, lit up like Christmas. What's a preserve without the wild in it? Ellis's eyes narrowed, but the room's energy shifted, a crack in the armor. Lena seized it, sliding a folder across the table, printouts of overnight donations spurred by the social media wave, totaling nearly 10 grand, plus a preliminary grant nod from the Wildlife Federation. This is progress. Give us 90 days to scale it. Eco Programs Ember as our ambassador. We've stabilized after the fire. Let's build, not dismantle. Harlan added his gravelly weight. I've run this dirt for 30 years, lose the heart, and the whole thing bleeds out. Hands wavered, then dropped. Ellis's face tightened, but the vote stalled. Tabled for review, a fragile reprieve bought with grit and grace. As the meeting dissolved into sidebar talks, Jake stepped outside, the fresh air hitting him like a cool compress. The preserve stretched before him, hills rolling under a sky scrubbed clean by last night's rain, the air humming with promise. Lena joined him, exhaling a long breath. We bought time. That's a win. He nodded, but his thoughts turned homeward. The pull of Sarah's steady hand, Tommy's drawings pinned to the fridge like talismans. The fight wasn't over. Ellis would circle back. The drought lingered like a bad habit, but for the first time, Jake felt the scales tip toward holding on. By afternoon, the rehab pen called him back. Ember was ready for her full release. Doc Ramirez giving the all-clear after a final check. The herd grazed in the north pasture, their forms elegant against the greening grass, mothers watchful over calves that mirrored Ember's fragile start. Jake unlatched the gate, the fawn hesitating at the threshold, her ears flicking toward the open field. "Go on, girl," he murmured, kneeling to slip off the halter one last time. She nosed his hand, a soft bleat of farewell, then bounded out. Leaps tentative at first, then fluid, weaving toward the herd with the grace of her savannah blood. She paused midway, turning back, those dark eyes locking on Jake's in a moment that stretched eternal, the rescuer and the rescued, bound by fire and trust. Then she joined them, a small shape vanishing into the group, her bleat answered by the herd's chorus. Jake watched until she blended in, a tear tracing the dust on his cheek, unashamed. Harlan clapped his shoulder from behind. "You did good, son. Place like this needs men who see beyond the fence." Lena filmed the reunion, her voice steady for the grant reel, but her eyes shone with the same quiet victory. Driving home that evening, the truck's cab filled with the golden light of sunset. Jake felt the weight lift, not gone, but shared. The preserve's embers glowed steady now, fueled by community sparks and hard-won delays. Sarah waited on the porch, kids tumbling around her feet, the aroma of grilled chicken wafting from the yard. Tommy ran up first, hugging his legs. "Did the deer go home, Daddy?" Jake ruffled his hair, lifting him high. "Yeah, bud. She's running free, just like she should." Sarah met his gaze over the chaos, her smile soft, the tension between them easing like rain-soaked earth yielding to growth. That night, under a blanket of stars, the family gathered around the fire pit in the yard, sparks rising harmless, stories shared over s'mores. Jake held Sarah close, Tommy's head on his lap, Mia dozing against her mother. The preserve's battles would rage on, droughts test the land, but in this circle, resolve burned bright. Ember's plea in the flames had ignited more than survival. It had forged a path through the wild, reminding Jake that some things, family, home, the untamed heart of Texas, were worth every scar. As the fire crackled low, he whispered thanks to the night. the tiny gazelle's spirit leaping eternal in the fields beyond. Leave a comment sharing what you thought about this story.